Yeah, so I guess first, thanks for having me. It's always fun to do these kinds of lectures. Um, Also, I should apologize ahead of time. I feel like sometimes I'm in more of a discursive mode, and then other times I'm less so. And I think this right now, because of some life stuff, I'm like a little bit less of in a discursive mode, so I might be stumbling over my words a little bit. Um, so just apologizing for that ahead of time. Uh, and I guess I'll just start with sharing my screen. And can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe you could go full screen if you.
Yes, I will go screen.
If you want a green. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just start a little bit about my background. I was born in West Berlin in 1984. This is me and my grandmother on the west side of the wall. And my mother is German and my father is ethnic Mongolian Chinese. So I spent a lot of time between Germany and China, and I still spend a lot of time between those places. So this is me again and my grandmother and my cousin in Tiananmen Square in 88. And yeah, and then at some point when I was 8 years old, my mother and I moved to the States because she remarried and she married an American and who was a Native American, an Apache. And so then in those years, you know, I was kind of exposed to this native community and way of life and ceremonial way of life, where we would travel to all the different powwows and all the different ceremonies. And this is actually a picture from our backyard. This was a sweat lodge that we had at our house. And so for those who don't know, sweat lodge is like this kind of ceremonial, sauna. And there's these hot rocks that are brought into the center. And then there's kind of singing and praying and things occurring inside in pitch blackness. This is a picture of the Apache crown dance, which is a very special kind of dance where the dancers, they wear these very ornate crowns that represent the people that gave them language. And you know, the thing about growing up in Arizona in the American Southwest is that, you know, I was kind of subsumed into two distinct cultures, and they were very, very different from one another. So on the one hand, there's the native culture, and on the other hand, I've had a lot of exposure to fundamentalist Christians as well, which in the American Southwest, it's kind of the dominant culture. And the differences between these cultures really, you know, stuck with me over time, and especially the differences in how they regarded nature was really something that stuck with me. So, you know, on the one hand, the native cultures, they really had nature at the center of their culture, and on the other hand, this white Christian American culture really, you know, disregarded nature in many ways. And it got me thinking, like, what is, you know, now in my practice, it really, I look back at it and I think, like, what is the real source of these differences, of these different cultures? And it made me think about culture as a kind of adaptation to environmental conditions, historical environmental conditions. So if you think about, you know, the difference between these cultures, you know, it makes you think about, examine the differences between like foraging cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures, and agricultural cultures, sedentary agrarian cultures. And so on the one hand, in foraging cultures, you have small group size, which means that they tend to be much more egalitarian. They have kind of social systems that kind of level the power dynamic between people. And there's also a much more pronounced gender balance. And then they also tend to be ecologically aware, that they recognize their place in a given ecosystem. And this ecological awareness is also at the center of their own religion and spirituality. And they have a spirituality of reciprocity, where they see that nature gives to them, but in return, at nature, that they have to give back to nature as well. And on the other hand, in agricultural societies, you have farming led to this idea of the private ownership of nature. Food surpluses led to class stratification. There's evidence to suggest that domesticated animals led to gender stratification, and they tended to have these kind of human-centered and anthropo-centered religions that really just reify political power and the power over land. But I think that this is just one layer of what constitutes cultures, and I think that there's several layers to the onion. I think one important one, for example, is the nomadic pastoralist culture that Europe that Europe inherited from the Proto-Indo-European culture. Which spread throughout, and most European languages are derived from this culture, which spread the horse and cow in like 4000 BC. But anyways, like these kinds of layers of cultural systems, I think, kind of basically set the stage for thinking about land as an extractive resource. And so really, you can think about religion as a kind of technology, so that there are protocols for adaptive behavior for local conditions. They're meaning systems. They produce adaptive behavior specifically at the group scale. They harness spiritual emotions to kind of fuel themselves. They align goals, values, beliefs, and norms. And they confer legitimacy and authority. And they even do things like manage genetic lineage, for cultural prescriptions as to who marries who, etc. And so if you think about, the religious history of cultures, and you can recognize that there's a sort of bias in the Abrahamic European culture that goes against matter. So, in the Bible, matter is depicted as this sort of inert and lifeless thing, and it was only through, the touch of God that life takes on form and life. But another layer of this, of course, is there's a Greek dualism that at some point synthesized with the monotheism of the Judaic monotheism. And anyways, all of those layers combined, I think, we arrive at this anthropo-dualism, which I think is at the core of how European or Western culture in general kind of thinks about reality. And so this has led to, thinking about nature versus culture, technology versus biology, mind versus body, matter and spirit, or matter versus spirit / consciousness, and also subject versus object. But what we're realizing today through science is that matter is actually innately dynamic. It's irreducible and emergent, It's self-organizing. It's contingent, meaning that it's even in principle non-computable. But most importantly, it's alive. But this dualism is baked very deeply into Western language and value systems. So this idea of materialism, of being materialistic, is a pejorative. It's a very deep down pejorative, and I think that it goes back to this kind of fundamental Christian idea of being in the world but not of the world. That the world was kind of inherently evil, and it's only the soul that's good. But the problem we run into today is that climate change is a material problem, and it can really only be dealt thinking in material terms. This is a picture I actually took in Santa Rosa in California in the wake of these one of these first mega fires in 2017. So it kind of led me to this conclusion that the farmer religions, the agricultural religions that are dominant today have become maladaptive. They're no longer they're no longer adaptive for our conditions today, for the environment today. And especially in American politics, Christian nationalism is like a very big issue, and I actually think that it's not discussed enough on the left. It's sort of like a blind spot. And I think there's several reasons for that. But anyways, the policies that they promote are really anti-environmental, and I think even to a sort of irrational degree that doesn't make them even a libertarian concept of producing value. I think at this point they're just destroying value. And in general, we're kind of in this truth crisis as well. We have this eroded trust in science. There's climate change, evolution denial, anti-vax, fake news, conspiracy, and also and that was in general culture, but even in critical culture, in critical theory, we still have remnants of this anthropocentric dualistic way of thinking. So there's the subject-object dualism, which is coming to us via psychoanalysis and phenomenology, which really privileges the human subject. And of course, it privileges narrative, like human narratives, discourses, language, etc. There's a sort of anti-spectacle strain in contemporary, in critical theory, and there's an anti-evolution sociobiology. There's also an eroded trust in science, which maybe we inherit from science and technology studies from like early Latour. But there's now there's a sort of catch-all term for these kinds of strains in critical theory, which is the idea of correlationism, which is just the idea that everything is ultimately correlated through the human subject. And here's a really great quote from Levi Bryant, he's a philosopher, contemporary philosopher. So the problem with correlationism is not that it drew attention to the relationship between thought and being, humans in the world, but that in doing so, it had a tendency to reduce other beings to what they are for us. Correlationism's question always seems to be, what are things for us? How do the beings of the world reflect us? And and so now there's kind of these certain new strains in contemporary philosophy that are trying to counter this dualism. So there's one strain is new materialism, which kind of started in the 90s. There's speculative realism, xenofeminism, object-oriented ontology, and even contemporary Latour, I would say. But I think the thing that really there's a lot of variety between these strains, but I think one thing that they all kind of have in common is this idea of a flat ontology. This idea that that humans are just on the same ontological plane as everything else, as all other beings. And I think that this is really well summed up by Timothy Morton when he says that it's about a solidarity with non-human people. And the thing is, you know, this is really the West for the first time awakening to something that in global indigenous cultures has already been at the core of their understanding. So they already have an inherently flat ontology. You know, they've known about and warned against ecological destruction for centuries. And they have this perspective of thinking of the world as made out of relatives rather than resources. And to them, the material world is sacred. You know, at the thing that in Lakota culture that you say at the end of a prayer is mitakeasin, and it's kind of like an amen, but it means all my relations. So at the end of any prayer, you say all my relations. And of course, you know, in the East, there's also specific strains of non-dualism in Buddhism and in Taoism, but I'll skip over this for now. So yeah, so back to this idea of thinking about religions as a kind of as technologies for belief, for affecting human behavior for adaptive purposes. You know, it leads me to this idea that, you know, a true decolonization today, I think, is a de-Christianization in a sense, and where we have to examine, you know, in culture these programs that are still kind of running beneath the hood, these dualistic programs, monotheistic intolerance, white supremacy, you know, the psychological blackmail of this idea of sin, and also very important, I think, this idea of apocalypticism. You know, this many people in power, you know, even in Brazil, for example, the Bolsonaro regime, they're also fundamentalist Christians, and of course they don't care about the Amazon because they think that, you know, the end of the world is imminent, and so there's no reason to care about the environment. So it leads me to this conclusion that that what we need today is maybe a new spirituality of symbiosis, or at least we need to articulate a possibility for a new spirituality of symbiosis. And I think that maybe a good platform for that is contemporary art. I think that in a way, contemporary art is already acting as a proto-secular religion. It engages in rituals. We have our places of worship. It kind of defines a moral community. At its best, it celebrates difference and diversity, and it creates spiritual value. And of course, you know, it's also beholden to corruption, just like any other religion. So that's in there as well. But this is kind of the basis of my own long-term project, which I'm calling New Peace, which I've had for several years. And basically, you know, I'm trying to sort of elucidate a possible potential spirituality of symbiosis for today. And so these are just some images from my work. Oops, it's stuck. Oh, here we go. So, and I think it might be, for many people when they're just encountering their work, I think what is very evident and maybe not so easily explainable is kind of the aesthetic packaging that I'm delivering the work in, which is this very commercial aesthetic. And so, for example, there's, you know, URLs and websites and stuff around packaging the work and creating this sort of ecosystem of signifiers. But the reason that I'm using the aesthetics of marketing, you know, which is in the West, I found is kind of an aesthetic taboo, actually. But the reason I'm using it is because kind of going back to this idea of a human as an animal, that you have to think about what are the things that access the human material cognition. And so I think about these kinds of images having evolved as tools of cognitive access. And you know, this is also where my like multicultural background kind of inspired me to think about it in this way, because I recognize that there's certain kinds of images that worked cross-culturally. And so that made me think that there's certain kinds of images that are species specific rather than culturally specific. And so, you know, under this idea, you can recognize technology as simply an extended phenotype of the human animal, and you don't necessarily think about technology as being this ontologically whole other thing that is purely a Western thing, because I think technology is also too often interpreted by the West as being a purely Western product, which doesn't recognize, you know, the technological scientific contributions of non-Western people, but also totally non-Western forms of technology as well. So, and I think that there's this term by this guy, this historian Yuval Harari, which is the hackable animal, that we're kind of awakening to this moment now when we're realizing we're these hackable animals. And I think for many people and for the discourse at large, it's kind of a scary discourse where we're realizing that these companies and these tools can really affect human behavior. But I think that what's interesting is to think about that actually this could also be a sort of empathetic bridge to the non-human, that we recognize that we're as vulnerable as any other animal to inputs and manipulation. So for that reason, you know, that's why I have been using these materials, and I think of them as a kind of material language assemblages. And so I think of a brand specifically as a kind of sculpture and a hyper object, in a sense, that's distributed over space and time, and you know, is kind of iterated throughout different objects. But also it has very specific exotic material properties and capacities. So, you know, the reason that brands work cross-culturally is that they have to do with how our memory behaves. You know, like we see an image over and over and over again, and then we associate specific emotions to it and specific feelings to it. And over time, just the iteration of that emerges into new properties. So people tend to like the images that they see repeatedly more often after a while. So all of these things, I think, are really fertile grounds for artistic exploration. Yeah. There we go. So I'm going back, I'm trying to use these materials then in order to articulate a new materialist spirituality. And it's kind of neo-pantheism, I think. And so so there's a rejection of the old dualisms and the use of media and branding and tools of cognitive access. And it's a kind of, you can think of it as a kind of mimetic machine ultimately for addressing climate change, which is, I think, the political strategy at the heart of what I'm trying to do. So there's these 4 specific concepts that I'm promoting with the work. So the first is this idea of the undivided ground, which is basically the philosophical notion of the Deleuzean philosophical notion of immanence. This idea that everything is one, and that's included in that is this the rejection of the dualisms of spirit versus matter, human versus non-human, nature versus culture. The second is the idea of faith and pattern. So I think faith is a very important tool for humans, and it allows them to act without information. And so I thought it would be very interesting to retool faith, the idea of faith, and specifically tie it to this idea of morphogenesis. This idea that emergent patterning occurs at all scales of reality, from the smallest grain of sand to the largest galaxies. There's this sort of aesthetic regime, and it's this self-organizing pattern that is everywhere, and it's also inherently unpredictable. But this is like this is really kind of me trying to articulate my own spirituality, my own sense of spirituality that I've always had, especially when I'm gone up and spent time in nature and just recognized all the patterns and the beauty that is there, and recognizing that no matter what happens in my life, no matter what I do, that I'm a part of this grand patterning that is occurring in the universe. And so the third one is this idea of pray to scale, which is just recognizing that there's this inherent spiritual, there's this resource of inherent spirituality in the recognition of the scale of reality. So, the feeling that you get when you're looking over a large landscape, looking at the mountains, or you're seeing the stars, or you're thinking about deep time, there's this innate, readily accessible feeling of spirituality that anybody can access. And I'm just trying to make that explicit. And so the last one is this idea of purpose from difference, which is, recognizing that the universe is fundamentally a process of differentiation. The universe started with just a big soup of hydrogen and helium, and then over the billions of years and eons, this is progressively differentiated into all the variety that we see today, all the biodiversity that we see today, all the technodiversity that we see today, all the cultural diversity that we see today. And it makes me think that maybe inherent to reality and the meaning of reality is difference itself. And I think that lends itself really well to a post-anthropocentric ethics that recognizes biodiversity and cultural diversity as very important pillars. So yeah, and then at this point, I'm just going to go show some different images of my works. So this is these trees that I scanned in California in the wake of the forest fires, and I made into these aluminum cast canopies or arbors. And this was on the High Line in New York. This is in Beijing in 798. This is a piece that I showed in LA some years ago, that's kind of talking about recursion. This is in Hannover, I think. So yeah, and I'm taking the form of these advertisements in a way, and so the image here, commit to a world outside yourself, I see as kind of like a call to action to a new materialist form of philosophy, I guess. This is in Berlin, Faith and Morphogenesis. Alive for Difference. New Faith, New Path, New Peace. This is in Milan, and I made a VR piece. It's basically like a video essay talking about New Peace as you're sort of flying through this desert landscape. This is a screenshot from there. This is in Beijing, where I started scanning objects that I would find in nature and 3D printing them. And I guess we can go back to any of these at some point if there's any questions. And this is images from my latest show, which I made which was in Washington, DC in November, right during the election, actually. And I worked on this show for over a year. And of course, it got postponed a few times. But I'm very happy that I was able to make it in 2020. So this is basically a 3D printed sculpture of the tree and these plexiglass pieces, which each of them are sort of steles for these pillars that I was speaking of New Peace. And then these light boxes, these custom light boxes I made of these landscapes. So I can just kind of go through these a little bit. And this is so I scanned this tree in Peru in 2019 actually, and this was the real size. This was like it was so big that I actually couldn't see any of the leaves, so I wasn't able even to identify it actually. But it was a very massive tree, and I did this yeah. And this is a prayer that also came to me in Peru. The whole idea for this show came to me actually in an ayahuasca retreat in 2019, and this was also a prayer that came to me as well in the ceremonies. Yeah, and this is kind of the end of my slideshow. So.
I'd like to ask you how you said that the it seems to me that like the platform, the new kind of platform for this new kind of spirituality is the branding as a kind of common platform, because you said that there is like this self-organization and well, there's something different, but do I understand it well? Like this is very interesting to use the branding as a new kind of platform for very uncommon kind of idea, because yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of aesthetic taboo, especially in the West. I found that the reaction to the work is quite different in Europe in Europe and in the States as opposed to in China. But I think that it goes to this idea that I think Westerners really associate technology with themselves and kind of over-identify themselves with technology. But also and in doing so, they you know, they don't recognize, for example, that that these kinds of materials and images, you know, also they act on a different level. They're not just a pure colonial export, and I think that that's very necessary to kind of to think about that plane of the human. You know, really the human as animal. I think that that's really at the core of thinking about, you know, how to sort of dig our way out of the anthropocentric condition.
And I see the works as a very kind of critical, actually, of this. Maybe this is the beginning of the work, and now it has taken some kind of different direction after, like, the recent events. But at the beginning, it seemed to me all the new piece project at the beginning as a kind of very critical towards the branding. Actually, do I understand it well, or is it?
No, you know, I think my work has often been interpreted as kind of arriving from this place of mimetic critique, you know, where, which is, you know, there's a long tradition of that in contemporary art, where you know, you kind of show the signs of capital, and you maybe dial them up to a point where it reveals their inner contradictions. And, you know, I think a lot of work operates that way. But I think for me, you know, the initial inspiration for that actually came from the East and came from Asia, and then also recognizing, you know, that certain kinds of images work equally, you know, are used ubiquitously in China as they're used in the States, as they're used in Germany, and it didn't really make sense to me to think that this is purely a colonial export. That I thought that there must be some other mechanisms at work. And yeah, I think really, I think part of what I'm trying to get at is that I think as Westerners, you know, it's easy to blame technology, but really what we're doing is we're sort of sleight of hand evading the responsibility of culture. So, you know, the colonial culture predates the Industrial Revolution. You know, the exploitation, you know, was already culturally there beforehand, and so yeah. So I'm trying to kind of tease them apart. Of course, they're you know, they're all ultimately intimately linked, but I think that there's room to sort of tease things apart and recognize where things are actually originating, I guess.
I think the whole situation is very absurd now. I mean, in this term of teasing, that the whole kind of the language that you use is very contradictory, in the sense that all the products, all these generic images somehow, or all this kind of marketing language is the engine of the consumption of the consumer culture that kind of destroys the planet at the same time. So,
right.
Does this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you think about Christianity, for example, you know, it's also this kind of marketing entity as well, right? It has its logo that it's been spreading far and wide for millennia. It has its own narratives that it's been spreading far and wide. So really what I'm trying to point out is that the systems that we have today are really no different in essence from what has always been occurring. Really, ultimately, they're operating on the human cognitive potential for symbolism and for narratives, and so, you know, for that reason, I've always tried to approach the work from more of an anthropological perspective, where, you know, I'm looking at humans and seeing how they populate the imagery of their world, and really trying to think about why it is that's happening. And I think I think having grown up in these different cultures, it kind of allowed me to sort of step back from the really buying into the full reality of any one culture. And so in that sense, yeah, like that's where I'm trying to approach the work from. I think if aliens, for example, were to come down and see Earth and see the objects that the humans are making, they wouldn't necessarily make a distinction that like these are artificial objects that humans are making, and these are natural objects that maybe seashells are making, but they're both just different species that are mineralizing objects out of their environment. So yeah, in that sense, yeah, I think the key is ultimately just to think about the human as an animal. And I think that there's also this sort of Christian guilt mechanism beneath this as well, where we're like, oh, we're consuming the planet, and there's this consumer culture, but really it's not. It's it's actually the culture itself. It's not. Sorry, it's like if there was an indigenous culture operating kind of the levers of power that had at its core, at its spiritual core, this recognition of nature and environment as something that you value, then I think that we would operate the machinery of the global economy in a different way, basically. And I think that you can just recognize how in Western culture, children are just not like raised to value nature, especially in contrast to indigenous cultures. And it's also not just Native American culture, but it's global indigenous cultures. It's indigenous cultures in Asia, in South America, in Africa. They all have these inherent value systems that really center nature at their core. And so I think that is the biggest difference that has to be sort of addressed, and that isn't really addressed in a lot of contemporary discourse, because I think we're sort of blaming the tools for the problems of the culture.
And do you think there's,
if I got it the right way, so you are trying, or you are saying that now, because of the crisis of our culture, of our situation, we have to look for the origin of the crisis, of this dilemma, of this dual thinking, for instance. So we have to go deeper and to look for it in the origin, or in the process of culture. Mm-hmm. Did I get it right way? Because usually the way how we are dealing with the crisis is we are looking at economical condition, we are looking psychological condition, and all this kind of construction. But if I got it the right way, so you are saying before this economical system, before all this other system, there is this culture, and there is the origin of the problem.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that a layer of that constitutes the culture is the spiritual level.
Mm-hmm. And you mean this problem, and this is somehow, I agree that this is a big problem, this thinking in dualism, what is somehow the let's see, the way how the West Europeans think in this way of dualism. You would say that the origin is the Christianity, or it is much more older, or where is it coming from? This
I think that there's, like I was saying, I think that there's multiple layers to it, but I think that religion plays a very big role in basically marketing this kind of relationship to the world. And I think that it's not it's not examined enough. But the point I'm trying to make, I'm not trying to make this sort of an anti-religious project, but really I think that what's necessary is to just articulate a new alternative. I think that in spiritual, like the spiritual options that especially young people have today, there's not that many spiritual options. There's kind of the old farmer religions, as I call them, of our parents and grandparents, or we have new age kind of anti-scientific stuff on the other hand, and of course we can't really readily access indigenous culture and spirituality as well either. So I think that it's the project is just, for me, is trying to kind of sketch out like what would it look like to possibly introduce a new relationship to nature, a new spiritual relationship to nature. And and just recognizing that spirituality is just it's so close at the base programming of the human animal. It can affect human behavior in such profound ways. And so I think that that's kind of the level that we have to think about in order to affect human behavior. There's this theorist that I really subscribe to, the scholar who writes about religion, this guy named David Sloan Wilson, and he's actually an evolutionary biologist, and he thinks about religions as these adaptive meaning systems that emerge at the scale of the group. So really that they're the reason religions have kind of evolved is that they align human behavior for the group scale that they can then survive relative to external conditions, relative to their environment, or relative to other groups. And I think that this is a very important insight to recognize that today we kind of have to align. We're at this crisis where we're so polarized, but really we need to sort of spiritually align people to act in one direction in order for the whole thing to survive.
What was the name of the author, David?
David Sloan Wilson.
Wilson, like Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we have to start to think also about religion in new ways, because this West European modern tradition, if you think about religion, you think only in negative ways about this.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think this, and I like in the beginning when you said that religion is something like system of all this trying somehow to deal with the environment. So it's a system of rules for how you should behave, that you can somehow exist. So this is this kind of system. And I think the religion was there because the people, they needed it somehow, some kind of construction of system, how to behave somehow.
Right.
And this is what we lost. That that there was this, that the religion was also very close to the reality, or to the real life somehow.
Right, and now our environment has totally changed as well, and so we have to really rethink that relationship. Yeah.
But first, I think we have to change our relation to what we think about religion. What is it, and how we deal with it? Yeah, here in West Europe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Adam.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that there's this really interesting example for, I was talking about the sweat lodge, the ceremony where you heat up these rocks in this fire for all day, and then at some point you bring them inside of this sweat lodge, and then you pour water on it and herbs and stuff, and you pray to the rocks. And the interesting thing is that when the prayer, when you pray to the rocks, you're actually praying to the literal rocks that are there. You're not praying to like the god of the rocks or some sort of stand-in that the rock is to some deity, but you're literally praying to the rocks, and you're literally praying to the wind as it hits your face as you exit the sweat, and you're literally praying to all the creatures and all the beings and all the materials basically that are in front of you, and in all directions. There's this, the cardinal directions are this sort of core spiritual concept in global indigenous culture, and the way that they explain it is you're literally praying to all the relatives to the east, all the relatives to the south, all the relatives to the north and to the west. And sorry, there was one point. Sorry, I'll just keep going.
Can I ask you, what do you think about the on these terms of the transformation, and how does the coronavirus did was it a kind of lesson to the society and its change? Because I saw some very interesting video on your Instagram that was talking actually about this transformation towards the spirituality. There was this kind of 3D image of a fire, of a kind of mysterious. And it's going deep into our kind of the spirituality as a kind of representation of our odd kind of side, and that we kind of ignore by the. Do you think it's a kind of a lesson to us? How does it change, or how does it change for you, or how do you see these changes as the coronavirus kind of the
right? Yeah, I think coronavirus is just a symptom of ecological destruction. There's some animals whose ecosystems we've disrupted to the point that these viruses escaped, and it's also scientists today recognize they used to have this model of virology that was like the viruses are just there in these animal populations, and it's just a matter of human contact that then causes them to escape. But they're recognizing now that actually it's the destruction of the environments and the stressing of the environments and the stressing of the animals and the stressing of their immune systems, that create the conditions for these viruses. So really, this is an environmental accident, but also I think it's a message, it's a warning from the environment, that hopefully humans will recognize.
Do you reflect this somehow in your work? Are you doing something on that issue? Or?
I've written about it, but I guess I haven't really started a cycle of work yet from after Corona started. So I've yet to think about new artworks in the age of Corona.
The other question, you said that the art is maybe a medium that you can, or platform where you can discuss, or you can about these changes, or you can do some proposals for the changes. Are there other platforms where we can somehow deal with this problem? I mean, like political platform under the policy, or social, all this kind of platforms. So.
Right. Yeah, I think that of course, they're all connected, deeply connected in some ways. But I know, yeah, and I'm sure that there's plenty of. I mean, ultimately, these sort of changes in culture have to occur at all these levels. At the political level, at the social level, and I think that just art is a good fertile ground to maybe start talking about these things, because for example, me as an artist, I can kind of non-rigorously kind of access all these different avenues of research and kind of pull them together, and like a real serious scholar, you know, can't really do that, and they can't really necessarily have an output in the way that I'm doing. So yeah, I think that this is like maybe a good starting point in a way. And I think that it also has, you know, art still has some shreds of spiritual legitimacy, maybe that other spheres don't have as much of anymore.
They lost it.
They lost it, yeah.
Yeah. Art is still keeping it somehow. The rest are still there, yeah, of the spiritual. Right. Yeah. And another question, maybe.
By the way, should I stop this screen sharing? Maybe.
Okay. So you have these experiences you are showing in China and in US and Europe. What would you say? Is there a language or like the images that something like universal image? I know that language is very complicated. That language, that it is difficult. That there is no universal language. That we are thinking in special the culture, that our thinking or our language is a projection of our culture, that this is difficult somehow to develop an universal language. But how is it with images? Are there images, could we speak about universal images that everybody understands it in the same way, or are there different reactions? What is your experience?
Yeah, you know, I think this is very interesting. So, you know, a lot of my early work was, you know, it was kind of before I was going more interested in spirituality and things, and I was really more interested in sort of the mechanisms of culture and specifically the patterning, the possibility space of image culture, and so, you know, it got me reading a lot of like marketing psychology and things like that. And one interesting example that I found is this relationship to images of shiny and reflective things. So, you know, there was these studies where people were given salty crackers to eat, and then one control group was then given a glass of water and the other one not. And they were then shown images of different kinds of objects and pictures, and they found, and then asked to rate them. And then they found that the people that didn't receive the water rated images of shiny and reflective things higher. And so it kind of established that there's this innate link to water that reflection has. And I've always thought that was a very interesting level to think about images, you know, especially in art. For example, Jeff Koons' sculpture, you know, which is the ultimate reflective glossy surface. And, you know, the discourse that we're used to when talking about is that, you know, it's kind of arising from psychoanalysis, where the surface is like a representation of desire. But, you know, that it's not really explaining how that's a representation of desire. And I found that it's interesting, yeah, to think about, like, maybe, you know, there are these other aspects to our cognition due to just the way that our brain is structured, that we have specific parts of our brain that are dedicated to processing different kinds of images. And so for that reason, those kinds of images are going to, you know, become more prevalent in some ways. Another example is like the direct gaze portrait. You know, in advertisement, you always see this like face that's direct gaze, and you see it in all cultures as well. And you know, and also what's interesting is that like the the image of the direct gaze kind of came into prominence in the 16th century, where the oil portraits before, they were all like 3/4 or they were sideways gaze. And then over the course of 100 years, basically all of the subsequent images were then direct gaze. But I think really what happened was that image making discovered a sort of predilection, a bias, that cognitive bias that humans have towards the direct gaze, because there's they can measure things like galvanic skin response and stuff and show people images, and they've shown that images of the direct gaze stick in the memory longer. And probably the reason for that is, we have this very specific part of the brain called the fusiform gyrus, which is a dedicated neural hardware for recognizing faces. And it's a part of the brain that comes online very early in child development. So, babies already have it operating basically because they have to be able to recognize their mother's faces. And so it's all of these mechanisms of our animal makeup and of our animal constitution that bias reality in a specific way that I think has reverberal feedback effects on culture. And what I was really interested in thinking about was thinking about all of these structures in cultural image space as being sort of zones of stability in a given system, and specifically, I was really interested in Manuel de Landa's idea of the attractor, which is kind of coming from evolutionary biology, actually. Or contemporary evolutionary biology, where you recognize that adaptation is not just a matter of optimization or essentialization, but it's a matter of stabilization. So, there can be multiple vectors of adaptability in a given species constitution. So, for example, a peacock's tail, is adaptive in one way that it's sexually attractive to female peacocks, but then it's also, it's easier for predators to see you. So there's these conflicting pressures, adaptive pressures, and basically, species then sort of localize in stable states within the adaptive landscape. And I was really interested in thinking about culture in that way, thinking about like these ubiquitous images that we see all the time. They're really the evidence of this sort of deeper, this sort of deeper space of statistical, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but I think you get the idea maybe.
Yes. Okay, so Adam, do you have more questions? I think it was for me fascinating talk, and I agree in many points. I agree with you. So I think we have really to rethink not we, but the West European, US, American, or this you said this Christian, this white Christian in US, they have really changed their way of thinking and dealing with the reality. So we have really to change it. But it is so I think so difficult to communicate it, that there is this change for right. many people. Many people, they realize the crisis of environment and all these problems, but they don't realize, this is my feeling, that the crisis has really deep roots and that we have started with these roots, and these roots are our thinking. And this is so difficult somehow to communicate.
Right.
How do you see it?
Yeah, I think it's about storytelling ultimately. You know, I think that these what I'm calling tools of cognitive access are really the tools of storytelling ultimately.
You are right, storytelling. Yeah, not only this let's say this intellectual language, or how do you say it? So this kind of language, but really to talk in images, or to create images. Yeah.
Right.
You are right.
Yeah. And in emotion as well.
Emotion.
Like and especially spiritual emotion. You know, I think that that's such a powerful thing. And the narratives that access spiritual emotion are they draw a lot of energy from that.
You are right, yeah. And this is why all these old cultures and native cultures, they are working with the storytellings.
Right.
We lost it. The modern culture lost it, this kind of storytelling, at least. It's true. Yeah.
What kind of role do you think the art could play? Because I think there's a lot of pressure, or there's a lot of currents about the art should play some kind of role within the environmental issues. Do you think there's what kind of role art could play? Because this is some kind of major issue, I think, now what is going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's storytelling. I think it's the story of the environment. I think that that's what we should talk about. And I hope that, you know, after Corona, it'll kind of change. It'll push some people, especially the art world, in a way, in a little bit of that direction, because, you know, we don't have so much time left, so we kind of have to have an all hands on deck program.
Yeah. Amazing.
So we don't have question from the audience. Maybe somebody has a question, but do you have something, Adam?
No, nothing's coming up. It was amazing. Thank you very much for this talk. It's really nice.
Really, thank you so much. It was so interesting, and I appreciated a lot that you are coming from your own experiences, because I think this is really the point where you can, if you want to change something, or if you want to develop something, so you have really to start by your own experiences. So, and right. This is because somehow I did this experience also. I grew up in Prague in this Czech culture, and this language is the Czech is Slavic language. This is still a big difference to these West European languages. So I grew up in this culture, and then I left and I came to Germany. So this was also not like you, that you did really this experience. It was much more extreme somehow, this experience, this two culture. But I did also this kind of experience, these two languages, two different cultures, and somehow it was this experience somehow till now I am somehow dealing with this experience, and most what I am thinking about doing or writing or on following is somehow has something to do with this experience, or it's roots in this experience somehow. So I appreciated a lot that you are started with this kind of experience, and you are talking about it.
Yeah,
you are sharing with us this experience. Yeah.
I found that the work doesn't make any sense unless I kind of start at the beginning and talk about where it's coming from.
Yeah, because, you know, I am since years and years in this art scene, and so I met many artists, and there are so many artists. And I was also teaching for years and years students of art, and most of the students they didn't have somehow that was what they were dealing with. It was only what they read in the books, so it was not coming from their own experiences, from their own somehow body and feelings and so on. And my experience is, after these years, if you really don't have, I said every time, a problem, but is somehow part of your body, part of your feelings. So when you have all these problems you are dealing with, you read about it in the book. So the chance that you will be a good artist is not so great, I would say. Not so great, yeah, I would say, yeah. This was my experience, yes and yes, yeah.
And is there something that you're working on right now?
No, I'm just dealing with life stuff, apartments, and moving. Exactly. I was working so long on this show that I just opened in October, and then since then I've just been kind of checked out a little bit. But yeah, I hope to. I think this new year will be interesting. I think I want to make another VR work, and also do more writing. I think 2021 will be VR and writing for me.
And are you planning to come to Europe in next year or next year?
Yeah, I probably will when things are back to normal, safe to visit my mom, and yeah.
Go to Berlin, or are you also?
Definitely Berlin, yeah. My sisters live in Berlin, so I still have family there, and yeah.
So please let me know. Adam has your email, so he can give me. Please, I send you my email. Please let me know, because after this talk, I was really thinking about doing a kind of interview with you for a German magazine or something like this.
Yeah.
About these experiences. It would be really, really great if we could do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to.
So let me know, please.
Okay, I will.
Yeah.
Maybe physically in Prague, if we could bring you over.
Yes.
Yeah, and
just like that, but
then we bring you also to Prague. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. So to talk to more students, and because usually when we are doing these talks this is art school for applied art, but this is a very good school in Prague, and usually there are coming many students. I have no idea how many people were following this, but I think if we would do it really in the school, so there will be much more students and much young artists. So maybe we see you in Prague next year or in 2 years. Yeah, this would be great. Yeah. So thank you so much for really this inspiring talk. For me, it was so interesting.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
A lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, and I hope we stay in touch. So
yes, definitely.
Definitely. So thank you. Bye.
All the best.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.
Evening.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year. And
Happy New Year.
And we see each other next year.
Sounds good. 2021. Bye, guys.
Okay, bye.